Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. Without me is the soon-to-be-wed David Griscom, but he sends his best. But with me is Lainey Newman, co-author of Rust Belt Union Blues, Why Working-Class Voters Are Turning Away from the Democratic Party, along with Theda Skocpol. Lainey, thank you so much for being with me here today.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to chat.
I'm excited to chat too. We were talking, you were on Majority Report recently, and I was kicking myself that we didn't book you before our Majority Report bookers did here, because your book is really relevant to what we talk about here at Left Reckoning. And I just want to preface up top, I don't have any confidence in my ability to predict elections, and I don't like to make my political analysis like the Democrats need to do this or they'll lose, because I've seen them go against things I thought were imperative and then still win. So. But nonetheless, reading this book kind of did seem like getting a head start on reading the autopsy for a party that is, still alive and actually still like in power, but looking a bit shaky heading into election season. So I'm curious, what brought you to this research?
Yeah, I mean, I think similarly, I was curious about in the wake of 2016 and sort of the realization that the Democratic Party was not as strong as, as many people thought. So I'm from Western Pennsylvania. I'm from Pittsburgh. I had extended family members who were members of the United Auto Workers and worked in the Ford plant up in St. Paul, who've now passed, but members of my mom's side of the family, actually Latvian immigrants. And so I've been interested in unions and sort of this idea of like union communities and what it means to be a loyal union member for a while. But then in college, I started working with Professor Skocpol and doing some research with her and trying to understand political trends and changing voting demographics and trends. And then I wanted to sort of apply that to where I'm from, which is Western Pennsylvania, and tie the union element in. And so I think I arrived at this idea of trying to figure out why it seems like, union members have sort of abandoned a sense of loyalty. Many, not all, to be clear, but have sort of, are no longer as loyal to the union as they once were. And, sort of my family, being loyal union men, that was very much sort of like how I understood them. And so that's, trying to see where that went.
It was fascinating for me because I don't come from a union background. I'm from North Dakota, but I can actually relate to a lot in the book, which is like my mom is from the dairy farming eastern part of the state, Democrat voters because of the politics there. My dad is more on the western side, kind of the gun club. We'll get into that a little bit, like that sort of thing. And frankly, like I saw both, I was sort of alienated from the dairy farm side and also alienated from the gun club side by like basically media and wanting to watch. But anyway, like I felt that like a lot of this is about third places and who we choose to socialize with. And so like, before we get into the height of the unions and union men as like central to identity, talk about your region a little bit more, and maybe you can get into the distinction between trades and industrial unions a little bit too.
Yeah, definitely. So I started the project looking at Western Pennsylvania, the 20 county region that sort of encompasses the western side of the state up to Erie and down. Pittsburgh is in the, north or the southwest corner of the state. Erie's in the northwest corner. And so looking between those two cities and the surrounding region. There's a particular sort of ex-industrial, culture and sort of regional identity and outside of the cities, outside of those larger cities, and a lot of Erie as well. And so that's sort of how I define the research space. And then when I started doing the research with Professor Skocpol after I graduated from Harvard, and we actually were planning on, sort of trying to create this book about this phenomenon, we expanded our research and sort of encompassed some other areas in the industrial Midwest. I did some research in Detroit and at Wayne State University looking at the archives of the United Auto Workers. But I think that, what we're trying to understand is these these regions that used to be very heavy on manufacturing industries, or sort of heavy working class neighborhoods and towns, and had a lot of union presence, at least, at one point. And so the distinction between the trades and industry is pretty relevant in terms of regional space, because a lot of the industrial unions were very place-based. And what I mean by that is, centered around a certain plant or mill, or, very sort of regional and locational. Whereas the trades were a little bit more fluid. And so a lot of people worked on a lot of the trades sort of are often hiring halls for union members who work on a project basis. So they, go and travel for, 6 months to one location and work on building a new power plant or whatever, and then go and, and jump to the next one. And so our understanding sort of evolved throughout the project of how the region and how the localities of unions impacted these two different types of union members. And it's actually quite interesting and quite different because of the nature of sort of the movement of the work for the trades.
Yeah, I thought that was a fascinating thing, because you see these things discussed in very broad brushstrokes. Let's get to the height. And I don't know if you've seen this TikTok trend where it's like nostalgia of like the 90s, and they play this like moody music underneath it. But but like, it's always looking at like the 90s, and I'm like, man, like, I mean, I know that's when like some of us were kids, but that was when a lot of things were like going wrong in society. Mm-hmm. And you point to like even some of the sort of accounts you've heard you raise in your book of, the type of community that these sorts of union communities talk about, the height of unionism in America as like a sense of identity for folks.
Yeah, definitely. I think that unions, as you mentioned before, served as these third spaces. And by third spaces, it's kind of like, outside of, home life and work life. Where do people go? Where are people socializing? What is influencing, people's sort of sense of self and their networks and their communities? And for a long time, unions were very central in that, in that space. And so we talk in the beginning of the book about what the social underpinnings of the union man were. And we say union man in large part because, obviously a lot of these members during the height of unionism were men. And also because it sort of, it encapsulates this identity that I think a lot of people, even when I've talked, to people who don't know much about unions or whatever are familiar with. It's this idea, sort of an American history or lore or whatever, of like the union man, and so I think that at the height of union communities and union families and union men, people were interacting with unions in a lot of different spaces and in a lot of different ways. So not only at the workplace and not only as their sort of collective bargaining agent, but also, as union halls in the physical community were often gathering places for people to go to for ceremonies or weddings or banquets. Unions would partner with other community institutions like fraternal groups or ethnic groups or local churches. There was a lot of interaction between religion and local pastors or religious leaders and labor in at least in Western Pennsylvania and much of the Rust Belt as well. And unions would partner with high schools at times. So trying to sort of get expose unionism to the younger generation. They would have recreational leagues. That was a big part of what we were looking at, the softball leagues and bowling leagues and golf and all these, all different types of ways for people to engage. There was also, shooting was a big thing. And hunting has always been in a lot of these regions and communities a big hobby and popular pastime. That's something that's been a constant. I think that the difference now, and we'll get into it, I'm sure, later, but the difference is sort of the influences and whether or not, what the messages are behind that pastime, and the political sort of charge that it's and direction that it's going.
Yeah, one of the things that I found interesting, you mentioned the different religious identities and nationalistic identities, is like the different clubs. If you were like the Norwegian club or whatever, I forget the specific ones you mentioned, they would go to the other ones. It's like I'm not, but it kind of puts a lie to like you need to be very phobic to this anxiety about identity, right? Like they were doing both, I think, kind of at the same time. It was a good time for unions broadly, so you didn't have the angst about it. I think is that how you would? Because your book, we talk about the union man, but your book does devote considerable time to both issues of race and gender.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that there was definitely a process of expanding the inclusion and the membership of unions. I think, and what you say about the sort of ethnic groups is true. They were mostly social clubs. I think for a lot of people that they would get together with other coworkers and family, and that's what I heard about gun clubs today now too. Actually, that they are drinking clubs that have a clubhouse and you go and hang out with people on Sundays. Someone said, one of my interviewees said, that's where we go when the bars are closed or something like that, along that lines. And so, I think that these spaces have always existed for people to get together. And it's a kind of a question of the transition and sort of the evolution of, where people are getting together and what the messages are behind that, within and coming from those institutions.
Yeah, I want to get into some of your field work, but just for folks who are wondering why did all this happen, like we kind of alluded to maybe some of the simplistic explanations, which is like people got too diverse or too much focus on diversity. What are some of the broad things you would gesture to get people on a start to that?
So the political sort of evolution you're saying?
Or just the decline of unions. I mean, we're talking about this era where unions had this actual, you could drive people to the polls as just one thing that's relevant to people now, but also like create a better life for folks and a sense of community. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. A lot changed in the 70s, 80s period. There were, relentless attacks on unions, and I don't think that can be sort of discounted. I think in our book where we can come across maybe critical of unions, but because of various decisions that were made, but on the ground it was a struggle for unions starting from especially during the Reagan era and afterwards with all the right to work legislation, and it's been an uphill battle. But I think that in the 70s there was a huge sort of collapse of the steel industry, and that was caused by various things, including international trade agreements and sort of just increased competition from other countries that were that had newer technology. One of the things that we heard is that there was a failure to sort of reinvest in American manufacturing, and that the government wasn't supporting that. And it is true, I think, that a lot of people during that time saw manufacturing as inevitably going to sort of move out of the United States, and we were going to transition to this knowledge and service-based economy that in the process or sort of march towards modernization and march towards progress, I guess. And so it was this idea of, okay, well, we're just sort of going to give up or, choose to not, save the industry. And so that, I think, had a huge impact on industrial unions, not only the steel workers, but also, all the other industries that were affected by the steel collapse in the 70s and 80s. And I think then you see, you see Democrats being and Republicans, but even Democrats being less, sort of pro-union and pro-labor than they previously had been. The Carter administration, Carter was famously not very supportive of unions and famously didn't bail out the steel industry when it was struggling or sort of try to help, steel. And then with the 80s and with the the Reagan administration, I think that you just see just political attacks from every angle on unions, whether it's from the Supreme Court or from the administration. So at that point, I think that there was a lot that had been lost.
Yeah. And I'm curious, from your perspective as someone from a union background, like for me growing up, it wasn't until like Obama era where it became I'm like, oh crap, we shouldn't have decimated these ways of organizing. Because like, again, like to me, there was unions on the sports teams, because North Dakota's not unionized except for like there's some train rail union stuff like that, but like it was just theoretical. I forget what my question was actually, but I'm just thinking I guess I'll move on. You did some research in parking lots. Tell people about that. That was fascinating to me because I just want to say, like, there's a little bit of a sense apology in the book for like some people might not think this is very scientific. From my perspective, if I could know like what was in the parking lots of like any sort of group 40, 50 years ago, I would find that like extremely valuable information.
Yeah, that's actually funny you say that, because one of the things that we were trying to see is like, is there any way that we could get a proxy for what it was like back, like what cars, what, like how could we compare? And what we ended up doing is I went to some of my retirees and just talked to them about, what I saw and tried to sort of learn what it was like through their memory. But to give a bit of background about the whole bumper sticker thing, in the project, I was trying to sort of see how I could measure, sort of estimate political persuasions of people in unions on a larger scale than just my interviewees. And so I did a lot of driving around Western Pennsylvania, and there's still some unionized steel mills in Western Pennsylvania that were formerly U.S. Steel, and now U.S. Steel has been bought out by a Japanese company. But so I was driving around and I ended up going into some of these parking lots, and these were employee-only parking lots. So I sort of had like a sample that was only union members, because all employees are union members, and so of these steel mills. And so I was like, wow, I can look at the cars and sort of try to estimate, try to see what's going on. And what I found was just a lot of conservative, proud conservative views, and also a lot of support for gun rights and NRA membership and that type of thing. And that sort of went along with what we were seeing in the qualitative research that Theda and I were doing, with interviewing and ethnography and sort of looking at the archives and that type of thing. But in talking to the retirees, I asked, is this different than it was? And they were like, it's absolutely different. It would have been nothing. No one would have been, proudly displaying a GOP allegiance, back in the heyday.
Yeah. Talk about this Union Man to Gun Club pipeline a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that, as I mentioned before, people in Western Pennsylvania and in, Michigan and Ohio have always or many people have always participated in hunting or shooting pastimes and hobbies. I think that it's just sort of part of the culture in some of these non-urban areas, and that was definitely true during the heyday of big labor. And we sort of found in our archival research a lot of evidence of this, that union members were very engaged in gun ownership and gun life and engagement. There was talk of competitions. There was talk of leagues that were set up about shooting. There was people would send in pictures of their trophies of animals that they had killed. And so, I mean, I think that what we know is that it's not new. But today, when you compare, I think that what's different is that the hunting and the shooting and gun ownership has remained, and union density and influence has not. And so what you see is just a lack of sort of, and you know, I mean, there's been a lot of other changes as well. The NRA has gotten, increasingly conservative and extreme, and the Republican Party and gun ownership have become even more sort of intertwined with one another. And so now what you have is the NRA and conservative sort of Second Amendment messages. With no sort of counterweight about other things that are also important. And so I think that for a lot of people, the gun issue is very central. And that's what we saw on the bumper stickers. And that's what I heard in my interviews, that, that's a big thing. That's a big issue for people in this region.
Yeah, I mean, the qualitative shift in gun culture has been, I think, kind of alarming for me to see. Like the shift, and the NRA is a large part in to do, because my sense is that hunting isn't getting any more popular. Maybe I'm wrong about that. That's just my sense growing up. Is like I was hunting was something I did with my dad, and like my friends were home, playing Xbox. But maybe that's different in different regions. But like the sort of underlying message of that, like some people might be alarmed at the picture of a trophy buck, for instance. But to me, that's much more wholesome than guys holding like AR-15s or like seeing how many bullets they can spit down range for like some theoretical future calamity or something. Like it's underlying worrisome, I think.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think that the difference is the sort of underlying messaging that is behind like gun ownership, and there's been a lot of interesting research on sort of what it means to many people to own a gun and to be sort of like a citizen protector, is a term that one scholar used, and I think that it's become sort of a nostalgic identity, that people ascribe to, and some of it is sort of alarming. I agree.
The relevance for election season here. Talk about how it's deeper than just unions have a Rolodex of people that they can tell who to vote for, and why you can't really rely on them to just save a party because of that capacity.
Yeah. We found this interesting survey that the USW administered in 1955, and it had tons of questions about the union in communities and unions in politics and how members were feeling. This is an internal survey, so their own members, how members were feeling about different things that their union was doing. And one of the things that we found was people were very supportive of, the union being involved in the community and devoting even union money to community affairs. People were not supportive, for the most part, of people, telling them, or union officials telling them who to vote for. So even back then, I think that there was sort of, this sense of, we don't want the union to be spending its money on political matters or telling us how to vote or whatever. And so I think that this is something that has remained consistent over time, actually. The difference now is that, people don't have the sort of deep connection with unions that they used to, and that would influence them and, their votes. So what you have today is, there's still there's a Rolodex, and there's union people who go out and canvass and all that. But the sort of what union members are sort of their relationship to the union is much thinner than it used to be. And I think that even, back to the 1955 survey, people weren't voting Democrat because, the union bosses were telling them to vote Democrat. They were voting Democrat because of, their peer influences, because of their identity, because of this sort of like mutually supporting network and feedback system, right? Of, us versus them and whatnot. And so today, calling people up at election season and saying, as a union member, you should really vote for X, Y, and Z. It's not grabbing onto the same sense of loyalty as was once there.
Right. And I often say, like, there's a difference between maintaining democracy and cultivating it. And like, you actually, if you deliver for people, you can kind of trust them to behave themselves as you want them to as a political party on election day. And this, I think it says a lot to how democracy has been degraded, I think, since the height of these unions, that it's now like, how can we use them to control people, on the important Novembers?
Yeah. I mean, I think that like what you see now is just a lot of managerial sort of level people in DC doing lobbying and doing, campaigning and canvassing, or, sort of managing from the top down. And, and before, I think a lot of it was on the local level. People were sort of engaged with sort of a grassroots sense of unionism, as opposed to, a bureaucratic union.
Yeah. Well, Lainey Newman, the book is Rust Belt Union Blues, Why Working Class Voters Are Turning Away from the Democratic Party. Any place people should follow you or anything you'd like to plug?
Well, I am on Twitter. I'm also on Instagram, and I'm always willing to hear from people. So I'll give my email if people have thoughts. It's enewman, ENEWMAN @jd25.law.harvard.edu. Kind of a long one, but yeah. Thank you very much.
There you go. Thank you, Lainey.